When Kanon and Clannad get brought up in discussion, they are rarely ever far from one another, which stands to reason given they were all key adaptations of visual novels made within short time frames of one another. All three share a similar visual style, distinctive but highly localized settings, and help shape the expected character personalities and relationships of pseudo-harem anime casts thereafter. But just as much as all of this is true, all three also utilize Deus Ex Machina to make their climaxes work and end satisfactorily. And with this video, I'm going to specifically take a look at the differences of execution of this methodology in Kanon and Clannad Afterstory. Gets a passover for being far more esoteric and supernatural than both Kanon and Clannad and having overarching thematic goals that make a Deus Ex all but required to conclude, whereas its two sister shows didn't necessarily have to take this route. For the uninitiated, both Kanon and Clannad feature a male and female protagonist who spend time helping other characters through their individual problems and engaging in playful shenanigans themselves, leading to a recognition of love for each other. Both shows then seem to take almost sadistic pleasure in yanking tears from the audience as they brutally shatter the sweet and affectionate relationship of their protagonists. In Kanon, this is accomplished as the male lead Yuichi realizes the love of his life Ayu is nothing more than a ghost of the real Ayu, an apparition allowed by heaven or some other cosmic force to represent the comatose girl and fulfill her desire to be with him again after an accident in their childhood separated them and sent her into a 7-year coma. Clannad also forcibly pulls apart its male lead Tomoya from his wife Nagisa by having her die in childbirth and follows this up with their child's death only weeks after Tomoya had been reunited with her following a 5-year deep dive into depression and neglect. However, both Kanon and Clannad are not stories focused on the ideas of utter despair in this life. Rather, they are tales of hope and the end of cynicism, making an ending full of nothing but depression and the cries of those the dead have left behind, ill-suited conclusions. But as some would call unfortunate, in order to pull back from such a long road leading inexorably to sadness, extreme measures are required. Even more so considering both Kanon and Clannad Afterstory accomplished the feat in only a single episode. Both shows resort to the use of Deus Ex Machina, and here there's a sharp divide in the quality of the execution. Before moving on and examining how each show uses the literary style to reach the same end goal, it's important to remember that Deus Ex is not inherently a mark against a show. It's often discussed as a problem because it signals unpreparedness, laziness, or sloppiness on the part of the writing team. But there are also other cases where it is both enjoyable, intriguing, and engaging. I feel like a broken record sometimes with the frequency with which I say it, but execution is everything. And in Kanon and Clannad, we have excellent examples of how Deus Ex is used well, and less than gracefully. Tackling Clannad Afterstory first, the build-up to a Deus Ex is near perfect. A large part of why Deus Ex Machina disappoints us as an audience is a feeling of being cheated out of our catharsis. For a Deus Ex to function well, it must needs, in effect, give the audience what we want. This is far more difficult to predict for most shows, especially in those where the focus of the story is a clash of ideals or wills. Even in a case where there is a clear villain with no redeeming qualities from a narrative standpoint, there will invariably be those who root for him, and for whom he is the highlight of their experience with said show. To have the hero defeat him via Deus Ex Machina is less than unsatisfying for the villains as fans. It's more like an insult to their having cared about him as a character at all. Stories like Clannad Afterstory have some of this conundrum solved for them by nature of their genre. Rather than a clearly defined antagonist, Tomoya is pitted against circumstance and uncontrollable events in his life. There is no other some members might choose to side with, but just as well, Tomoya receiving grace is equally boring and lacking in catharsis if we don't care if he receives it one way or the other. Hence why the build-up before the use of the Deus Ex is so critical, and why Clannad has it in spades. We are forced to watch as Tomoya is suddenly broken into a shell of his former self, remade, and then broken again after only being able to watch helplessly from the sidelines. He is sent to the bedrock, and our cathartic desire is simply to see him regain a shred of happiness. Even only a sliver would be better than to leave him where the second to last episode ends. Given that Kanon is significantly shorter a show than Clannad, and doesn't have an entire season which functions essentially as a prologue, it's no surprise that its setup for cathartic release by Deus Ex is less fully realized. Ayu vanishes from Yuichi's arms and he begins to spiral in the same way that Tomoya does after Nagisa dies, but is rescued from it by the fact that the real Ayu is still alive. However demoralizing it may be to watch him tend to the comatose Ayu with no recompense, his own attitude of hope and confident patience is a form of catharsis on its own. While his circumstances with her may not be exactly a picture-perfect image of what we would like, Ayu is still with him in a sense, as opposed to Tomoya, who loses Nagisa and Ushio beyond what patience and perseverance can relieve. However, Kanon does go to considerable lengths to counter its shorter runtime by incorporating the slow reveal of Ayu and Yuichi's history with one another. Watching their childhood friendship develop and end so abruptly with Ayu's fall extends our cathartic desire to see them together by proxy to the actual events the two of them experience in the present. But where Kanon slightly lacks in cathartic preparation for a Deus Ex, it closes the gap to Clannad with setting up our expectations for a Deus Ex Machina. By the very nature of the technique, a Deus Ex Machina is abrupt, and possible only because the narrative wills it so. The point is in its mechanical inexplicability, a miracle of sorts. This tends to not sit well with us because it is far too similar to luck, and a character's success is far more interesting if accomplished on his own merits. To have a Deus Ex which doesn't stink of lazy writing, minimizing this sense of highly specific divine intervention is crucial. Kanon chooses to do this in the simplest but also most effective ways, the same way which countless shonen series allow us to buy into the hero's ability to overcome his progressively stronger foes. If Yuichi and Ayu are to be saved by the supernatural, we have to believe that the supernatural is simply a part of their world in the same way we believe a shonen hero's success is a part of his story. In Kanon, with the exception of one, each of the girls Yuichi meets and helps are all wrapped up in some kind of supernatural occurrence. Ayu herself is a manifestation of her wish to be with him, Makoto is a fox spirit who willingly sacrificed her life to take human shape to enjoy Yuichi's company as a fellow human, and Mei is gifted with inexplicable healing powers. Wherever he goes, Yuichi seems stalked by the fantastic, leading us to be far less cynical when Ayu is revealed to have finally woken up, Deus Ex style. We've been prepared, primed if you will, for this kind of solution as we've been shown repeatedly that this is how the world operates. Clannad aims to utilize the same technique with the Dead World and Fuko, but it falters for several key reasons. Chief among these is its presentation of this alternate reality. Rather than be an integral part of the story which directly affects the characters, Clannad's Dead World is esoteric, brief, and presented largely as a metaphor. It is sprinkled throughout the show in sparse clips that largely serve to make more explicit the feelings of the characters in the sequence prior or scene or episode shortly to follow. That it is the basis for Nagisa's play in the first season of Clannad only furthers the perception of it as a metaphorical elaboration on the show's actual events that assist extrapolating the emotions of the cast so that there are no awkward explanations on their part or excessive inner monologues. The research of Kotomi's parents and the two instances of lights of happiness in Afterstory provide hints that the Dead World could be more literal, but between these instances, it continues to be used in the ways I already mentioned, so feels more like coincidence and the show's flavor of fate than anything. Fuko, or rather the spirit of Fuko, provides a more grounded recognition that the supernatural could play a part in the story of Nagisa and Tomoya, but it lacks two critical attributes which Kanon achieves. Firstly, Fuko's arc is the first to be tackled in Clannad, and no other supernatural stories of any sort of depth occur thereafter until the show's climax. Unfortunately, where the show's length gives it advantage over Kanon in the character development and audience pathos departments, hurts it here. By the time the climax had me scratching my head in pleasant bewilderment, I had all but forgotten that a supernatural component couldn't be ruled out because of Fuko. It was only the next day, after having been mulling over the ending and germinating the ideas for this very video, that I realized the connection. Furthermore, Fuko's appearances post her arc are all comedy skits, in which the joke is that despite affecting the situation, she doesn't actually exist and is forgotten as quickly as she appears. This only serves to subconsciously delegitimize her impact on the story in the mind of the audience, further removing our association of Fuko's spirit with the potential for some miracle to save Nagisa. And finally, the Deus Ex Machina moment itself. In Kanon, the Deus Ex is handled in a way that perhaps provides some, albeit speculative, proof that utilization of Deus Ex Machina was planned from the start rather than a necessary narrative backpedal hastily cobbled together by the writing team. As Kanon's final episode comes to a close, it plays a montage of Yuichi and his friends helping to tend to the unresponsive Ayu, but conveniently fails to show Mei in this slideshow. It instead concludes the sequence, ending with Yuichi alone in the hospital room, a scene which we are meant to understand has been playing out identically for Yuichi's remaining high school years. Mei enters the room and after some brief small talk asks him to leave before a white fade to the final scene of a physically recovering but very much awake Ayu. Everything about this scene downplays the massive because the writers said so feeling most Deus Ex Machinas exude. The inclusion of Mei harkens us back to both the supernatural stories that have been the bulk of Kanon and a reminder that she has apparently limitless healing power. But by not ever actually showing Mei perform any healing for Ayu, her inclusion in the show is not sidelined into that of a narrative convenience. While it is heavily implied Mei healed Ayu, there's no actual proof that this is in fact the case, simultaneously preserving her identity as a worthwhile character in her own right, whilst also minimizing the sense of Deus Ex to wake Ayu and give her and Yuichi a happy ending. Additionally, Kanon doesn't linger on the catharsis. The final scene is just long enough to convey that the Ayu we are seeing is in fact the formerly comatose and therefore real Ayu, and that she and Yuichi are happily together. Were it to overstay its welcome, the brevity of the Deus Ex itself would be magnified and feel more narratively cheap. By keeping its catharsis as limited as the method used to achieve it, Kanon comes as close to a perfect Deus Ex Machina as I've ever seen. By contrast, Clannad spends a full episode of uncertain, borderline ominous buildup before unleashing its Deus Ex Machina. We are able to process the very real nature of the dead world only moments before it literally detonates in a fiery, flashy blast of light and takes us back to where Nagisa would have died in childbirth only for her to live. The remainder of the episode is a montage of all the major moments of Ushio's growth, marred by Nagisa and Tomoya's absence, revitalized by Nagisa's survival. The issues Kanon expertly maneuvers around in delivering its Deus Ex, Clannad practically falls straight into. Where Mei's involvement is dubious and allows a continuation of mysticism, the nature of Clannad's dead world is explicitly made known, and its follow-on impact is represented in the massive explosion of light. Nothing about this is subtle or validating to anything that had happened in Clannad's actual story. None of what Tomoya has overcome or accomplished offers justification to the involvement of the dead world, save a vague assertion by Nagisa that the city desires its denizens to be happy, which itself is a desperate leap of supposition, as the only connection the dead world had to Tomoya and Nagisa was highly personal and not so nebulous. On top of this, the speed at which the timeline alteration occurs follows standard Deus Ex fashion, but is offset by the extended following montage. Rather than allow the audience to simply be at peace knowing that even if it was by authorial intervention, Nagisa and Tomoya are able to remain happy and then quickly ending, it drags on. Catharsis, in my experience, is a rapidly experienced and internalized emotion. Confirmation bias on soul, if you will. As such, the lingering montage is not only unnecessary, but negatively impacts Clannad, as its lack of furthering the story, which is effectively concluded by this point, only gives the audience time to try to grasp at the Deus Ex Machina they just witnessed. In short, despite doing better than most in setting up for a Deus Ex Machina, Clannad botches the actual technique itself, while Kanon performs both elements with admirable marks. Both shows are excellent in their own right for a myriad of reasons, some similar, some unique, but they notably stand tall as comparable sisters for what does and doesn't make a Deus Ex Machina ending satisfying and well constructed. And in a world that grows more media literate by the day, it's important to not only have examples of a good and bad execution of a concept, but examples that allow us, by their deconstructions, to identify the elements of good and bad to better spot them elsewhere. Catch you on the flip side.